So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about career strategies at this stage. After I've already gone through in some of the other videos about how to begin training, going to graduate school or medical school, and then doing postdoc years and trying to hone your craft in terms of both the technical aspects as well as the scholarly and the intellectual aspects of things. And so at some point in time, you get to a point whereby you say to yourself, the question is, how do you know when you've trained enough and it's time to go out into the world and get a real job, as my wife used to tell me, and go forth? And I think there's an easy answer to that, because when you're a trainee, you're basically an apprentice, and you're subservient to your mentors and your peers and other people in the laboratory. And as you go through your training periods, both graduate school and then your postdoctoral years, you gain layer upon layer of expertise. And things come up on a day-to-day basis in the lab and in your reading and in conferences and in lab meetings and so forth, whereby you say, well, that's an interesting thing. Nobody's really looked at that or whatever else. You just say that to yourself because you don't want to tell them what you're thinking. and so, the beat goes on and you go on to the next thing and so forth. But ultimately what happens is you get to be anxious to do your own thing. And that's when you know that it's okay, enough of this training business, even though you realize and you know that you haven't learned everything, because you can't. I mean, it's impossible to learn everything. And so there has to be a point in time where you say, okay, now I'm ready. The thing is, one of the aspects of science versus maybe something else, and I'm not so sure it's really any different, but in science, in addition to the vast fund of knowledge that you have to layer on and be comfortable with and understand, what's known and what's not known and who did what when and so forth. The technical aspects of things are one of the things that I think holds you back a little bit, in that you realize after a while, it takes a long time to perfect your craft, the handicraft of your discipline. And you spend a year or 2 or 3 perfecting this technique to the point where you can do it probably better than anybody else. You realize after all that hard work that it takes a while to become an expert in something. And then sometimes people are reluctant to let that go. And so what they do is they look for projects that they can use this technique for. And that's a big mistake, because you ultimately run out of projects. And there's only so many things you can use to use this particular technique that you're really good at. And in science, the name of the game is that you have to learn new techniques, always, all the time, to answer whatever question it is you're trying to get at. And it's frustrating, because you know that it's going to take you a while to be able to do the next series of experiments that you need to do in order to nail it down or open up this particular aspect of things and so forth. And so you have to say to yourself, okay, it's enough already. If I have to learn new things, I'll just have to learn new things. But now I know how to learn new things. That's what you've learned in your training. So nothing should stop you from ultimately flying, leaving the nest and flying forth into the world and doing your own deal. What you have to do in order to do that is that you obviously have to go out on the road and apply for jobs and be interviewed and usually give a talk to the mentor's lab and so forth, or wherever you're going. And that's when you essentially gather together all the things that you've learned over the years in terms of how to put a talk together, how to put your slides together, how to really organize what you're going to say and saying it so that the people really understand what you're saying. And as you go through your talk, what you're trying to do is impress them as to your expertise and how learned you are on the one hand, how scholarly you are, and how meticulous and careful and thorough and wonderful you are. And so all of those things go into the mix of things. And if everything goes right, and as you go around and give these sort of employment talks, you get better and better at it. So the more you do, the better off the better you are. And the other thing is that you have to be very careful with your acceptance of a new position. It's not, the grass is not necessarily always greener on the other side of the hill. It could be you're getting yourself into deep trouble. So you have to be very, very careful about that whole thing. Now, let's say though that you've gotten a new job and it's in academia, and I'll probably focus most of my thoughts or discussion on that because I've been an academic my whole career. So it's in academia and you're an assistant professor, and now it's time to sit down and get your own funding, which means that you have to write grants and get funded through the grant system, usually through the NIH. They basically fund 99% of the basic fundamental biomedical science that's out there in our country. And the budget of the NIH is around $30 billion, which sounds like a lot until you compare that to the Defense Department of $700 billion. And you realize that you're just a tiny little thing in this whole big country of the United States of America or wherever. But anyway, the $30 billion does a pretty good job of funding a lot of the people that are in the universities in our country and the research institutes and so forth. And I think, looking back over my career, I was very lucky. I sat down and wrote a grant when I came back from France. And the very first grant I applied for was funded. I said, well, this is a piece of cake. This is easy. But it didn't always hold true as I went along in the whole thing. And my batting average went down from 1,000 to maybe 500 to 330 and so forth and so on. But in order to write, a grant writing is an art form in and of itself. After a while, I really liked it. It was quite a heady experience, actually, because there's always a deadline that you're working towards. So it's not like writing a paper. There's a sort of a deadline in that instance too, because you want to get it out there. You don't want to just have it sit around for a long, long time. But with grant writing, if you miss your deadline, then you have to wait another 4 months, essentially, before the next, because they have 3 grant deadlines a year. You got this deadline, and the first order of business is that I learned very, very rapidly is that you should take a long time to write your grant. You can't write a grant in a month before it's due. You should start 6 months before it's due. And you have to be completely focused on this grant writing business. And it's essentially Fantasyland, because what you're trying to do is impress the reviewers of your grant. These are the only people you care about. And so you can't propose to do something that's already been done. And so it has to be new and novel and so forth. But it also you have to convince the people that are reviewing your grant that this project is, number one, it's doable. Number two, it's really important. And number three, you're the only one in the whole world that can do these kinds of experiments the way they should be done. And that's a pretty tall order. But one of the reasons I got to really like grant writing was because you can let your mind wander. You can say, well, let's do this, and this would be really wonderful. And so you get to be in a very upbeat mood while you're writing these grants. It's not like writing a paper where you have to be very careful not to overstate your case. In grant writing, you got to overstate your case, but you got to do it in such a way that it doesn't seem like it's being overstated. And so that whole process takes a lot of creativity and a lot of thought and a lot of massaging, and so that's why you can't write it in a month. If you write it in a month, it won't get funded, and you'll be back at ground zero all over again. So just like writing a paper, the same sort of 3 rules hold forth. You have to be concise, because you've got a page limit in these grants. You can't go over it. You just can't. They won't accept it. They'll send it back to you. And so that you have to be concise in terms of how you phrase things and how you talk about things and so forth. You've got to be tightly integrated so that each portion of the application is is integrated with the other parts. And you have to be more so than anything else, you have to be persuasive. Persuasive in all the different things that I just said, so that by the time the reviewer gets done with reading the grant, that person is convinced that this is really great. This is the best thing since crushed ice. That's what you're aiming for. And so if you have to also understand that what it's like to be a grant reviewer. I never wanted to do those grant reviews. Did everything I possibly could to not do that, because it's a lot of work. Because if you ask to be on one of these grant review committees, usually there's about 20 people on a committee, and usually each person on the committee reads 20 different grants for the review cycle. It takes a long time to read these grants. You know, it's not like reading a novel or even a textbook. It's because you can't just say, well, whatever, I don't like this grant, or I'm not gonna. This guy should never be funded. If you come to that conclusion, then you have to tell them why when you write your critique on that whole thing. And so you have to make it, when you're writing the grant, you have to make it as easy as possible for the reviewer to get it. If you make him work for it, he just, whatever, and he'll put it on the reject pile. So everything has to be really logically organized. And so that one thing flows to the next thing, that flows to the next thing, that flows to the next thing. And it's much like, you know, in science, one of the very first things I wrote when I was a medical student was an abstract that I sent to a scientific meeting. I'd never written an abstract before, so I didn't have the slightest idea of how to go about writing an abstract. But an abstract obviously is a very short one-paragraph summary of the whole project, right? Well, grant writing is the same way. And so I gave my abstract to my mentor, and he read it, and he brought me into his office, and he looked at me and he says, okay, well, this is okay for the first go around, but let me tell you how you need to write these things. I said, okay. And he said, first, you got to tell them what you're going to say, then you say it, then you tell them what you've said. You got to give them to them 3 times, otherwise they'll never get it. And I think that whole thing, that rule of thumb works on the grant writing thing as much as anything else. I guess the last thing is that when you're writing a grant, the worst thing you can do is leave out the critical work by the guy that's going to be reviewing your grant. Of course, you don't know who that's going to be, so you have to be very complete in terms of your literature search. You just don't. You can't only include the references for the past work that supports your argument. You got to make sure you're basically very, very all inclusive in the whole thing. So the thing is, the next thing, so you get your first draft together, and so then the next thing you do is you've got to ship it out to all your friends who will deign to read your grant, because they're busy people too, and they've got other things to do to sit around and read your grant. So you have to have good friends, and then you've got to listen to them when they give it back to you and give you a critique on what you're doing. And the more people you send it to, the more different things you'll get back in terms of, you know, this is good, but we don't like that, and so forth and so on. And so I can't say enough about that whole process. It's really probably the most important part of the business. Now, the good news is, if you get funded, you don't have to think anymore. You can just get up in the morning and brush your teeth and go to work, because you've already thought it all out, and you've thought it out in such great detail. But what you do need to do when you get to that stage and you get the money is that you have to educate your team as to what the whole story is all about. And a lot of times you think to yourself, well, I've already gone over that with these people, and so why don't? But you really have to continue to beat on it and hit the nail on the head over and over and over again, so everybody gets it. Because if they don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. A lot of laboratory work is essentially very repetitive and boring. You got to understand why you're doing all these crazy things, because if you don't, it's not a very interesting job. Essentially, you get bored very, very rapidly. So that brings you in your career path now to the point where you've got your job, got your grant, and you're ready to rock and roll, and you got to get a team together, because I think, as I've said in one of the other videos, science is a team sport. You can't do it all by yourself, because it's very competitive and it moves rapidly. So if you try to do everything all by yourself, you'll lose out. You may be the best scientist in the world, but you'll be too slow all by yourself. You got to have help, and so you have to begin to recruit people to come into your laboratory. And I think most people start out with hiring technicians, and then after a bit, the grad students and then hopefully postdocs join the group. And it takes a year or 2 or 3 to build up a group of maybe half a dozen people, enough to then start to work at a reasonable pace, so that you have things together. And the thing is that because it's a team sport, you become, as if it's your laboratory and so forth, you become the coach, and the manager, or the team spirit and everything. The thing about science and medicine is exactly the same way. In business school, if you go to Harvard Business School, they have a whole bunch of courses in management. And a lot of people just major in management, but they become managers then. And so they're managing all the other people into what they're doing. And maybe someday, as time goes on, they'll have these kinds of courses in our schools as well, but they don't. They haven't. And so you have to learn how to manage and the people on your team, so that everybody's working together, so that everybody understands what the story is and what you're working on and how important it is, who the competitors are, where they are, who they are, what they're like. And so all of this is a process by which the team manager gets the team so that it's a highly functioning unit. And basically, you're only as good as the worst person on your team. And so everybody has to be up to speed, up to snuff, and really dedicated to what they're doing. And I found, and I think I've said this before, I found management the most difficult thing to do. One of the reasons, the major reason, is that each individual on the team is different. Sort of like, we weren't created equal, like it said in the Constitution. We're all different because we evolved. We have different gene sets, and we've come from different backgrounds and experiences and so forth. And we're at different levels. The people in the laboratory are at different levels. Some have just graduated from college and are, say, at the technical level. Others have graduated from college and are now in graduate school. Others are postdocs, other young faculty. And all of these people, as being members of the team, have to be, as the manager, you have to really get to know these people very, very well. Now, you don't need to be their bosom buddy, but you have to be cognizant of what they are. So you have to be very careful about all of the individuals in the laboratory. And I had my antennas up the whole time. One of the things about science that is great is that it's a very, very intensive experience on a daily level. And the management aspect is one of the things that makes it so intense, because you have to be always aware of how somebody is functioning. You never know why they're malfunctioning or if they're not functioning up to snuff, but you can tell there's a problem that you need to deal with. One of the things about science that's very, very important, and this is something that I learned only over time, but actually my wife, who is chef, restaurateur person educated me, because she was really a very, very good manager of people. She had different people in the kitchen and different people out serving, and a whole cadre of people with different aptitudes and different levels and so forth. And it was very similar to my business in the lab. And she said, you have to tell people what you expect from them, what you want them to do. Then you have to tell them how to do it, show them how to do it. She said, and then once you've done that, and they seem to have gotten it, you have to check up on them. You have to hold them accountable. And that's the thing I don't think I always did as well as I should have. I just assumed that they were going to go off and be wonderful scientists when I wasn't watching them. But one of the ways you can hold people accountable is in the laboratory meetings. Depending on what kind of a lab it is and so forth, we used to have meetings once a week, and which would last an hour or two. We usually do it on Friday morning or something like that. What we did is I rotated people through these, so that your meeting day was next week, let's say, on Friday, and so you were expected then to show your wares. So what have you been doing with yourself? And you can do that with different kinds of things. You can make slides, so forth. And that's part of the training process about how you learn to get up in front of a group, organize your thoughts, and tell them, what the story is. And that's one of the ways you can hold them accountable as the manager of this group, because if the person is not performing well, then you need to step in and take them aside. And you don't want to do anything in front of everybody else, but so you take them aside and you try to you coach them, you give them pointers on how to get things up to snuff and so forth.